They are accusing Democrats of saying we spend too much. For anyone that wants to entertain that thought, I ask you to think about the last time a person has said in this country that the government does too much for them, that their Social Security check was too high, that teachers are paid too much. When was the last time anyone has heard or seen that?
My friend from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, said, quote, "I ask you, think about the last time a person has said in this country that the government does too much for them. When was the last time anyone has heard or seen that?" I'll say it. I'll say it right here. I don't want the government doing most of the things that the government is doing to interfere with the ability of the American people to carry out their lives, federal, state, and local.
Did you just hear that? AOC is out here on the House floor, bold as brass, asking when anyone has ever said the government does too much for them. Seriously? Is she living in a completely different America than the rest of us? Because I'm pretty sure that's a question millions of Americans could answer in a heartbeat. In these clips, we're going to see a stark contrast. On one side, you have the progressive big government narrative that just keeps expanding. On the other, you have common sense, reality-based arguments, especially when Chip Roy steps up to the mic. He absolutely skewers the kind of thinking we just heard. It's a must-watch if you care about real solutions and accountability. Stick around, because after this video, we're going to break down exactly why Chip Roy's responses hit home for so many of us, and I want to hear your thoughts on this whole exchange in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button, and subscribe if you're with us.
My friend from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, said, quote, "I ask you, think about the last time a person has said in this country that the government does too much for them. When was the last time anyone has heard or seen that?" I'll say it. I'll say it right here. I don't want the government doing most of the things that the government is doing to interfere with the ability of the American people to carry out their lives, federal, state, and local. When was the last time you had a bureaucrat show up and you said, "Oh joy, thank you, I'm really glad there's a bureaucrat here"? When was the last time you were thankful for $32 trillion in debt, $100,000 almost for every man, woman, and child in America? Anybody thankful for $32 trillion in debt? Anybody? Anybody thankful for a border that's wide open being exploited by cartels while fentanyl comes in and kills our children? Everybody thankful for that Department of Homeland Security that doesn't actually secure the homeland? Everybody thankful for an FBI that went after Scott Smith and labeled him a domestic terrorist for daring to defend his daughter in a school board meeting because she was assaulted in a bathroom? Anybody thankful for the IRS knocking on your door, auditing the poor and the minorities 3 to 5 times more? People thankful for that? Are you thankful for the EPA or the Department of Interior that sent a man to prison because he had some ponds on his ranch in Montana? We have a government that is weaponized against the American people and is undermining our liberties, and they want more of it. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle want more government. They want more taxes. They want more spending. They want more bureaucrats knocking on your door.
Representative Ocasio-Cortez, what do you say to that point, right? When we've got a significant amount of evidence that China owns the vast majority, if not all, 80% plus of the cobalt mine production coming out of Congo, et cetera. And we know, I think it's irrefuted, that there's child labor exploited to get those minerals. Those minerals are central, if not fully necessary, for the production of EVs, which even objectively we have to acknowledge are not fully able to power the ability of the American public to get to their jobs and their work and so forth. And yet we're mandating that we have 2/3 of the production be EVs by 2030. So if we follow those mandates by the Biden administration, that debate aside, right? Debate for a different day. If you follow those mandates, you got to have a massive, massive amount of battery production. And by all indication, the vast majority of that Congo production is controlled by China. A huge amount of that has child labor and other issues that we've talked about, and you got trafficked child slaves that are reported in the production of it. Why on earth would we want to limit the ability of Americans to go mine cobalt? Now, I might say, well, that's kind of great because I actually still want the internal combustion engine. I actually think it's affordable and better for the American worker who wants the plumber in San Marcos, Texas, to be able to go to work and afford the car. But if you buy into the motion of having, EVs that you can drive all over creation, even if you're from Texas and you had to do like I did, I appreciate the chairman pointing out the passing of my grandma. I had to drive 6 hours, like 300 miles to go see my grandma Thursday before she passed away, and 6 hours back. I couldn't do that at an EV. I wouldn't have been able to make the round trip in time. But okay, assume we were able to ever produce the batteries that last long enough, the charging stations, all the stuff. Why would we get rid of the American production of it?
Thank you. There are several different components to your question. I want to make sure that I address them. First and foremost, on the issue of child exploitation, child labor, I think it is the role of the United States for us to push back forcefully on this production, and not just in the production of energy, but across the board. We see this in textile production, energy production, cobalt mining. It is horrific, and we need to make sure that our sources do not include child labor. But to get to the core of the question, too, on the China front, is that I find it interesting that there is this concern about Chinese ownership of minerals, and it is legitimate. However, the response to that seems to be deregulation specifically for companies that are largely Chinese-owned here in the United States. These companies are subsidiaries where the benefit of what we are deregulating here, and I'll give you a specific example. I would be remiss not to mention that the minerals produced specifically at the proposed Twin Metals mine that is implicated in this legislation would most likely be shipped to China for refining and smelting to be sold on the global market. These are not American-owned companies that American mined minerals would be going to. And so if your concern is the Chinese predominance of ownership in the mining market, I would be very concerned about passing this legislation. So that, I think, on the China piece there. And lastly, on the meeting our targets and mining cobalt. I think it's a false choice to say that in order for us to mine cobalt, we either have to destroy some of the most sacred lands in the United States or rely on child labor. There's responsible mining in the United States that is available to us. But secondly, I also find it interesting that the majority presently pushes back against battery recycling, which would allow us to open the path to reducing our reliance on mining in general. There is enormous potential in recycling many of these EV batteries, but we have not made the investments or the shifts necessary in order to unlock that so that we can reduce our reliance on solely mining as the only source of battery. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Before I give my colleague a chance to respond, as I think he probably wishes to, I would only note that happy to have a conversation about restricting Chinese ownership of any number of corporate activities in the United States, or ownership of farmland, or ownership of land near military bases, or frankly, ownership of meat packing, production, including mineral production and so forth. A significant reason why it would be mined here and shipped back is because they've got all the production facilities, because they've been building and mining these, because they've got the resources to do that. And here we've got the God-given benefit in America being able to produce very clean burning natural gas, very efficient ability to have automobiles that have an internal combustion engine, which are basically fractionally about 1.5% of the CO2 production when you compare it to what we're producing in China, as the gentleman noted, where they've got 1,100 coal-fired plants burning in China, and we have 250, and they're building 2 a week, and we're building none. And yet we're building no nuclear plants except for the Georgia plant that was finally put online 45 years after it was permitted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I think if we're going to be serious about it, we can't say, I just don't accept the premise that this sort of general notion of, well, we got to push back on the child labor. Well, I mean, we're going to use that child labor unless we find a supply right now, because the Biden administration has put their foot on the gas to say we must have EVs in 2030 at the extent of 2/3 of our entire production line. So Toyota is not a Chinese-owned company, but Toyota has a massive production facility in San Antonio, tells me that they will largely have to put their entire assembly line starting next year into EVs pretty much only because they can't financially afford to do otherwise with these mandates on the tailpipe rule, which will be shutting down the internal combustion engine production of the Toyota vehicles. No Chinese ownership there because that's where they are, which will then mandate the EVs, driving up the price of those vehicles. And then they got to go figure out how to get the batteries and get the production. I know the gentleman seemed like he wanted to jump in on that, and so I'd like to give him a chance to respond.
I appreciate the opportunity to respond. So many things to talk about here, and I agree with the assertion that we don't have the refining and the smelting capacity in the U.S., but that's self-imposed. You go back to 1995, we produced 3 times the copper of China, and today they produce 11 times more copper than us. They have 50 smelters, and we have 2. That's another area of regulation that's forced business like that out of our country to China, and they're making the things that we need. We're exporting wealth to China to build these projects, and we have the resources that have made this country strong and that are still here to make us strong in the future if we will just use them.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman. I will, in the interest of time, yield back. I know there's other issues here. I would just push back on the general notion that these aren't important pieces of legislation. I mean, dealing with figuring out how we're going to protect our federal lands and the wildlife and the ability for hunters and anglers to use them, all that stuff are all part of this legislation, and we all share an interest in conservation in that respect. Look at Texas. We have very little federal ownership of the land, happily so. But where we have federal lands, we ought to try to manage it appropriately for good stewardship for multiple generations, including production and AMWR, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of the footprint of the entire state of Alaska. Lots of studies about wildlife benefits and so forth. But we'll put that aside for a different day, and I'll yield back my time.
Okay, let's just get right to it. That entire exchange was a masterclass in the difference between DC political fantasy and American reality. AOC starts by asking who could possibly think the government does too much. It's so out of touch, it's stunning. She might as well be asking who thinks water is wet. And that's why Chip Roy's response was so powerful. When he stepped up and said, "I'll say it," he was speaking for every single one of us who's ever dealt with the IRS, filled out a ridiculous government form, or watched our tax dollars get flushed down the toilet. He wasn't just talking about spending, he was talking about the weaponization of government, the FBI targeting parents, the EPA crushing ranchers. That's the too much she pretends doesn't exist. But the second half, the debate on EVs, is where the hypocrisy truly shines. Roy lays out an undeniable, brutal truth. The radical push for EVs directly fuels a supply chain that runs through Chinese-controlled mines in the Congo, a place notorious for using child slave labor. That's not a talking point, that's a fact. So what's AOC's response? She calls it a false choice and tries to pivot by talking about battery recycling. A great idea, but it's a deflection from the immediate, horrifying reality of the policy she supports right now. You can't mandate a product that requires cobalt and then act shocked when we have to get that cobalt from the only places your policies allow it to come from. Her argument that we can't mine here because it would help Chinese-owned companies is the ultimate self-own. Why do we lack the domestic refining and smelting capacity? Because decades of crippling regulations, championed by her side of the aisle, pushed our industrial base overseas and made us dependent on our adversaries. So no, it's not a false choice. It's a choice her ideology has forced upon us. Either we embrace American energy independence and mine our own resources responsibly, or we bow to a green agenda that makes us complicit in child slavery and empowers the Chinese Communist Party. Chip Roy chose common sense and moral clarity. It's a shame the same can't be said for everyone in that room.